Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome back to AJ108 Criminal Investigation. My name is Tony Farrar, and of course, I am your instructor for this semester. This week's lecture is going to cover Chapter 12, where we are going to look at robbery. And yes, I love Legos, so I thought it would be a nice introduction to have a picture of Legos as they relate to robbery. So I've fulfilled my Lego obligation. But let's go ahead and get started. And I want to start with the FBI crime clock. Now, we've learned from previous chapters where I've shown you this type of crime clock that the FBI will publish not only yearly crime statistics, they also publish these yearly crime clocks. And while the yearly report encompasses a lot of encompasses totals, let's say all of the murders, all of the rapes, all of the robberies, etc., along with special classifications of crimes that they pick out and publish, like hate crimes. The interesting aspect of the crime clock is that it deals with frequency, not the total numbers. So it records the frequency of those Part 1 crimes, those crimes that every police agency within the United States is required to report to the FBI on an annual basis. And typically these are the person crimes, if you will, and these are the property crimes. Sometimes they list arson in here at the bottom. It appears that they did not do it in this particular crime clock, but they do have a separate section for arson as well. But the interesting statistic here is that if you look at robbery, there is one robbery basically reported or occurs every 1.9 minutes across the United States. And that is actually kind of a scary thing when you think about it, right? And to give you just a little bit more to think about would be, where are these occurring? Where do these robberies typically take place? Well, as you can see, this is sort of a generic graph, but you can see the majority by far are on a street and highway, and the typical weapon that is used is going to be very close between physical force, which would be what we call a strong arm robbery, or a firearm, which you know what that is. So that kind of shows you a little bit about the weapons. So jumping into our lecture by way of introduction, robbery has plagued the human race throughout history. And robbery is one of the 3 most violent crimes against an individual. Most robberies were committed on streets and highways, or highways, and we saw that. But robberies also possess a definite hazard to law enforcement, along with the challenge to law enforcement. And we'll talk more about the challenge, but the hazard component is that typically robbery suspects are going to be armed. And, while a lot of them will still use force, physical force, they might be more than willing to get into a physical confrontation with a police officer, or actually use their weapon, whatever that is, against law enforcement. So these are the added hazards as it relates to dealing with robbery suspects. Excuse me. So as we look at a couple of pictures, you can see, or I'd like you to look for maybe some of the challenges that you might see before you. So in this picture, you can see that the individual has a glove on one hand, but not on the other hand. Now, typically, we don't get a lot of evidence at robbery scenes, but here we might. But you can also see that this person has a face covering as well. The same here, completely gloved up, have the ball cap on, but I think you could probably see the person's face in this one. So again, these are going to be some challenges that we'll talk about. The takedown type robberies with more high power type weapons, and usually more than one suspect. Usually it's a team or a group of individuals, and this person has their face covered. The same with this one. He doesn't have it totally covered, but yet you can see that there are going to be some challenges because he may not, if he doesn't touch anything, getting a good picture of the individual's face could be difficult. And then, of course, there's always Santa. So while, you talk about disguises and costumes and challenges, this one would be kind of an interesting challenge as well. And of course, this person is wearing gloves. So as an overview, robbery takes many forms, from the daring exploits of criminals like John Dillinger to what we call purse snatchings and muggings. Now, whatever the form, the potential for violence is going to exist. By definition, so we kind of know what robbery is, and here's your textbook definition. Robbery is the felonious taking of another person's property, either directly from the person or in that person's presence, through force or intimidation. Now, that's the definition, but robbery happens not always with your standard kind of weapon. You see, to compel compliance from the victim, most robbers carry a weapon or threatening item with them. And they're going to make an oral demand for the desired money or property that they want. And the overt display of a weapon or indication by the robber that a weapon is concealed, let's say in a jacket pocket or something, usually keeps that victim from trying to fight the robber. So we're not going to have that transfer of any kinds of evidence. But here again, we're talking about the fear factor or the different types of weapons. Well, this one's pretty obvious, and you can see the suspect in this case is using the weapon and fear, and also wearing gloves and things like that. In this particular case, the same thing. The individual is wearing gloves, and even though he might touch the cash register, he has gloves on. And sometimes, like I said, sometimes robbers will use something a little bit different. They might use something like a note that you can see here. And I really like this note because I think it's kind of cool. So, some robbers, again, present a note rather than speaking. And the robber may not ask for the note to be returned, but it is important evidence if it's left behind. So here's the note. And I like the wording. I have a gun. Keep your hands where I can see them. Give me the money out of all the tills, and the tills are the cash register. And you will not get hurt. Act normal and make it fast. Do not be a hero. I just want the money, okay? Hurry up. So why do you think that some robbers might use a note? Now remember, it's force or fear. So if you think the individual has a gun and they pass you this note, that's still fear. It can still, it can instill fear in those that are the recipients of those notes. Another reason that they might use a note is that it doesn't have an enhancement. They're not using an actual firearm. It's still a robbery, but they're not using a firearm. A firearm will give them an enhancement, meaning more time if they are convicted. So kind of an interesting thing. And then here's a case in Santa Monica where law enforcement identified a robbery suspect who claimed that he had an explosive device. So again, sometimes, there's going to be some type of weapon or other threatening item, or just the mere threat or indication that the person is armed, etc., in order to get the property that they want to get. So hopefully that kind of makes sense. Now, despite the inherent danger to the victim during a robbery, most robberies do not result in personal injury. The theory being that the threat of force or the presence of a weapon reduces the likelihood of the victim resisting. So confronted with threatening statements, threatening note, or even a visible weapon, most robbery victims, they're going to obey the commands of that particular individual. So we've learned a little bit about the textbook definition of robbery, but I would like to go just a little bit further and share with you the California definition. Because remember, in order for you to make a case and bring this case to the prosecutor, you're going to have to be able to prove all of the elements. So for California, you can see that the elements that determine robbery are just a little bit more than the generic definition that was listed in your textbook. So let's look at it. The felonious taking of personal property in possession of another from his or her immediate presence against the victim's will, accomplished by force or fear. So this is the California definition. So how is robbery distinguished from theft then as a crime against a person? Well, it's due to the danger of using force or fear. If there's no force or fear, it's probably just going to be a theft. But then we'll throw a twist in here in a couple minutes, and we'll add in burglary. So some other things that are required for robbery in California. Robbery is going to require the specific intent to deprive the owner of their property. And the taking of the property in robbery is going to require two things. One is called caption, which means gaining possession of that property. And two is asportation, and that's the actual physical carrying away of the property. So this taking part must be accomplished by the use of force or fear in order to meet the standard or the elements for robbery in California. Kind of talking about a couple of the other elements. In robbery, again, the taking must be either from the owner's person or their immediate presence. Well, person is easy, so like a purse snatch where they grab onto it and the person fights back, and maybe the person is struck a few times. Well, that's force or fear, and that will make the claim for that particular element for robbery. Okay, now immediate presence is in there because sometimes they will have you put the item down in front of you. So it might be that the person points a weapon at you and says, throw your wallet on the ground or throw your wallet on the counter. So it's not on your person, but it's in your immediate presence based on the fact that they threatened you. Does that kind of make sense? So that's why California puts in that immediate presence clause. So the element of consent in any one of these definitions of robbery is lacking in the crime of robbery because there's no consent, right? So you're not freely giving it to, they're taking it by means of force or fear. And when the victim is unaware of the taking of the property by reason of the suspect, let's say, being knocked out or something like that, it's still going to be robbery. So you have a couple of little gray angles here. But in cases where absence of will is brought on by the victim, so let's say that you're voluntarily intoxicated and somebody reaches into your pocket and takes some money out, that's not a robbery because you can't establish the force or fear, right? Because you're like out. Does that kind of make sense? So in this aspect, you're knocked out, as a result of the force or fear, and they take the property. Here, you've voluntarily, you passed out, and they're just removing something from you. So that the absence of will is, and I hope that kind of makes sense. So this is not considered a robbery. It's going to be merely a theft case. So now just a little bit about fear. So the fear of unlawful injury to the person or property of the person robbed, or of any relative or member of his or her family. So the fear doesn't necessarily have to be directed right at you. So look below. The fear of an immediate and unlawful injury to the person or property of anyone in the company of a person robbed at the time of the robbery. So even if you're with me, there's still the fear factor. So it may not be directed at me, it could be directed at the person I'm with. So hopefully that kind of makes sense a little bit. So a lot of different things to look at, especially when you talk about California. Okay, so just kind of finishing up. Some violence, fear, or intimidation must be used in the taking of property by robbery, or the crime is theft. So we've kind of said that a little bit. So I'll give you an example. Theft from a person, and here we are, like a pickpocket. It's not robbery, again, because there's no force or fear. You can't prove it. So if I just reach in and pick your pocket and take your wallet, there's no force or fear. If I'm unconscious laying on the ground from drinking too much and you take money out of my pocket, I can't prove force or fear. Reaching into your backpack like that, I can't prove the force or fear. Does that, and hopefully that kind of makes sense. So similar, and we're almost done with like the definition part, similar as we learned in the chapter dealing with murder. We talked in the last chapter, we talked about death and death investigation and homicide and murder. Just like with murder, robbery will have degrees. So first degree robbery includes robbery of a bus, a streetcar, a taxi, an inhabited dwelling, or using an ATM, like before or after using an ATM. So that would be first degree. And then second degree would be all other types. All right, and then finally an attempt. So most crimes can have an attempt. So when the intent to commit robbery is evident and the robber has taken an act towards the act, he or she can be convicted of attempt robbery. And consider, though, that mere preparation is not enough to meet the attempted robbery requirements. What you need is the robber must be dangerously close to actually completing the crime, and then you can get the attempt section in there. All right, so I spent a lot of time on the overview talking about different definitions, both the textbook and California, and specifically talking about elements. And again, it's important to know because you're going to have to be able to establish those elements, and the prosecutor is going to have to be able to prove all of those elements beyond a reasonable doubt in order to get a conviction. So let's talk about some other kind of different types of robbery, if you will. A particularly brazen type of robbery that has become widespread recently is called apple picking. And this is where a person, the suspect, basically snatches an iPhone or an iPad or any type of other mobile device directly from the hands of its user. So you see all those people walking down the street and texting while they're walking. So in this instance, somebody would either run by, skateboard by, bicycle by, and they would forcibly grab the item out of the individual's hand. And it's becoming quite a bit more frequent. And another interesting aspect of robbery that is gaining momentum is called robbery by appointment or Craigslist robberies. And this is where a suspect meets with the victim through the classified ads site, so through Craigslist. And the victim is robbed, and often there is an assault that goes with the robbery. And uniquely enough, there have also been several highly publicized murders as the result of these Craigslist type meet by appointment crimes. And I believe it was from about 2004 through maybe 2013 or so, there have been 86 murders linked to this Craigslist classified ad website type crime. So again, Kind of an interesting type thing. Also, a couple of other things to consider: that most robberies are committed by men. Robbers are usually serial criminals, and they may commit between 15 to 25 robberies or even more before they are arrested or, apprehended. So, people who commit robberies are often, a lot of times, braggers. And because of the fact that they might tell other people of what they've done, informants are very helpful in these types of investigations, because they hear a lot of things that are being said kind of on the street, if you will. And along with that, I wanted to talk about typical targets. So the most frequent victims of robberies are drug houses, liquor stores, fast food establishments, jewelry stores, convenience stores, motels, hotels, and even private residences and ATMs. So these are some of the characteristics. And then I want you to kind of consider some other characteristics of typical robberies that are out there. So the first one, they are committed by strangers rather than acquaintances. So typically robberies are constructed in that manner. A lot of times they are committed with the use of stolen cars or stolen license plates, which kind of makes sense because you don't want to drive your own car to the robbery location, right? Because that would be kind of not good. Next, they are committed by 2 or more people working together. So there are lone suspects in lone robberies, but a lot of times they're committed by 2 or more persons working together, because the person outside or might be a lookout or a getaway driver, etc. Next would be the offender lives within 100 miles. So they're going to want to know the area a little bit, so they know what the escape, so they can plan the escape route or know the habits of certain individuals in certain towns. So typically the offenders will live within about 100 miles of where they're doing their robberies at. And again, robberies committed by a lone suspect tend to involve lone victims. It's kind of a crime of opportunity, if you will, kind of spur of the moment. So lone suspect a lot of times equals lone victim. And with robberies, there usually is less evidence because a lot, the target locations, banks and jewelry stores and liquor stores, and even fast food locations, they have cameras. Sometimes they have security. So in order to kind of circumvent that, the suspects will cover their faces, wear a hat, even wear makeup. A lot of times they'll wear a heavy jacket so they can cover almost every part of their body. They'll wear gloves. So a lot of different things. So they're not caught on video, etc. The next would be that they take much less time than other crimes. They're a very quick crime. We don't always, the majority of the time, we don't catch a robbery in progress. You have to get very lucky in order to do that. A lot of times you catch the robber leaving the scene because the actual crime happens so quickly. And then finally, older people tend to be victims. And I think that kind of speaks for themselves. They probably appear to be easier targets. Maybe they would have more money. They don't have quite the situational awareness, if you will, as perhaps younger people might. All right, so those are just some considerations when we talk about characteristics of robbery. So now let's look at the classification. So again, in the previous chapter, we looked at different classifications of death. So now what we're going to do is we're going to look at different classifications of robberies. So robberies are classified typically into 4 categories, and each committed by different types of individuals using different techniques. And these classifications are residential, commercial, street, or what we call vehicle driver. So let's talk about residential. So residential robberies include those that occur not only in private homes, but in hotel and motel rooms, sometimes garages, and maybe even in an elevator. And these robberies are less frequent than other types, but are certainly dangerous and traumatic because they tend to involve entire families. And entrance into these locations, a residence, is frequently gained by knocking on the door and then forcing entrance when the occupant opens the door. Most residential robberies occur in the early evening when people are more apt to be home, and victims are also frequently bound and gagged or sometimes even tortured as the suspect tries to learn about where the valuables are. So they may tie somebody up and bound them and even torture them in order to get them to tell them where their valuables are at. In some cases, people are robbed because, let's say, they arrive home and they discover it's a burglary in progress. The burglar is thus forced at that point to become the robber. So these are, again, some things that go along with residential robberies. And you can see this type of robbery takes place often, not as often as some of the others, but it does make the news. And again, it's very frightening, extremely dangerous, and traumatic because of all the individuals that are involved. And one last thing before we kind of move on to commercial. A type of residential robber that challenges police departments across the country is this home invasion or home invader robber, who usually targets a resident, not the residence. So home invaders often target women, senior citizens, or even immigrants, sometimes even drug dealers, people that they consider either too vulnerable to fight back or who possess enough cash and contraband, like for a drug dealer, to be worth the risk. So they'll scope the individual out and they'll go in and they'll commit that robbery. And that's basically a home invader that targets the person versus the residence. Okay, so now let's talk a little bit about commercial robberies. So convenience stores, loan companies, jewelry stores, liquor stores, gas stations, and bars are especially susceptible to robbery. And drug stores are apt to be targets of robberies because they can get both narcotics and cash. Commercial robberies typically occur most frequently towards the end of the week between 6 p.m. and 4 a.m. And stores with poor visibility from the street and few employees on duty are the most likely targets. Many stores now keep only a limited amount of cash on hand during high-risk times, and stores also attempt to deter robbers by using things like surveillance cameras or alarm systems or security guards, both armed and unarmed, and in some cases, even guard dogs. And also, because those who commit commercial robberies tend to be recidivists, which means that they're in and out of jail, so they're committing a bunch of these crimes, their MOs, or their modus operandi, should be compared with those of past robbers. So for example, some robbers prefer to hit businesses first thing in the morning, and this is known as a morning glory robbery or a morning robbery, catching arriving employees off guard and then forcing their way into the business to take cash or property. Now, on the other hand, other robbers prefer to strike at the end of the business day, and this would be termed a closing robbery, when the potential for cash on the site is highest or when employees are maybe more distracted and less vigilant. their thoughts are kind of focused on going home or at least leaving work. And sometimes these closing robbery suspects, they believe that at the end of the night or the end of the week especially, that one of the employees will be doing a money drop. So they'll save up all the money during the day, and even though they might be in safes, at the end of the night they'll take it out of the store safe and they're going to transport it to the local bank and do what we call a night drop. And if you work for any type of small business, maybe you've done a night deposit before. So, just things to consider. And then finally, many robbers of convenience stores are on drugs or robbed to pay for drugs. And the majority of convenience store robbers report being under the influence of an intoxicant when they actually commit their crimes. And typically convenience stores that are robbed once are likely to be robbed again. That's not a guarantee, but it is likely that it might happen again. So now let's talk a little bit about street robberies, and I'll show you a couple of real quick pictures of commercial robberies. So this is a gas station robbery, and you can see in this photo that the individual is not wearing gloves and he doesn't have anything over his face. So we might find some evidence. We might be able to get some good evidence in this case. This one might be a little tougher. The person is wearing the hoodie. He's got something covering most of his face. His one hand is in his pocket, and his other hand is out, but he's not really touching anything. So, something to look at though. If this person, before he got to the counter to pull this gun out, if he barehanded this can of beer, if that's his beer, after he does this robbery, this could be a good piece of evidence, right? So we have to start looking at things like that. The same here. This suspect does not have anything covering his face. The clerk has a good view of the suspect, and hopefully, they're able to be, identify him pretty quickly. Surveillance camera actually caught this robbery in progress, so more than likely there'll be some good evidence on this case as well. All right, so street robberies. So street robberies are most frequently committed on public streets, thus the name street robberies. But it also includes sidewalks and in alleys, parking lots, and sometimes parks during the evening or nighttime, and often in dimly lit locations or areas. And most are committed with a weapon, but some are strong arm robberies. And remember, that's the type where physical force is the actual weapon. And both the victim and the robber are usually on foot in these street robberies. Speed and surprise typify street robberies, meaning that's typically how it happens, which are often crimes of opportunity with little or no advanced planning. Now, because such robberies occur so fast, the victim is often unable to identify the robber. And sometimes the victim is actually approached from behind and they never see the attacker. But because most street robberies yield little money, this type of robber often commits several robberies in one night. So again, going back to that MO file and start looking at the manner in which the crime occurs, not the why, but the manner, and maybe matching that MO up with a suspect that you know has been arrested for that particular crime in the past. So a couple of photos just of some street robberies. And again, remember, surveillance cameras are great evidence. Okay, and our last classification is going to be vehicle driver robberies. So drivers of taxis, buses, trucks, delivery and messenger vehicles, armored cars, and personal cars are frequent targets of robbers. In fact, taxi drivers are considered to have one of the most dangerous professions in the country. Taxi drivers are vulnerable because they're often alone while they're driving around looking for their next fare. They work early mornings and late nights when fewer witnesses are likely to be present to see anything. And a lot of times they're dispatched to high crime locations. And sometimes they might carry a lot of cash. Now, some taxi companies have actually taken some preventative steps, such as placing protective shields between the passenger and the driver, and also reducing the amount of cash that the driver might carry. Many cab companies are now equipped with credit card scanners to further limit the amount of cash on board, and some of the larger companies have equipped their fleet with onboard cameras, particularly those that frequent high crime neighborhoods. And other examples of, let's say, like ride sharing, Uber, Lyft, etc., have really gotten away from cash transactions entirely because of the fact that they would be dispatched to a location by themselves. Typically, they drive by themselves as well. And when they get to the location, they're robbed of the cash that they have. So now, for the most part, I believe they are strictly, credit card only, or your Uber app, or the app that, for whatever, whether it's Lyft or Uber. And then I talked a little bit about armored cars. Now, these are typically carried out by teams of individuals. You're not going to have probably one person rob an armored car. It's going to be planning. It's going to involve several people, kind of a robbery team, if you will. It's not a bank robbery, even though it's the bank's money. Remember, these are proceeds from all different types of businesses that end up going to a bank, etc. But a bank robbery is different. So this still falls under the conversation of vehicle driver robberies. And then I want to show you this picture because we talked about just regular vehicles that are being the subject of being robbed, individuals. So this is a picture of a car that was in the drive-thru at one of our local fast food establishments. It was late at night. The driver and his girlfriend were ordering food when they were approached by a single armed individual. The suspect demanded money and they refused and started to drive away. And as they drove away, the suspect shot and killed the male victim, who was the driver. And then the vehicle ended up here. And our investigators came out to investigate this case. So we are seeing, again, just a single vehicle, you can be involved in a robbery. Okay, so now let's talk a little bit about a couple of different types of robberies. We're going to look at carjackings and then bank robbery. So, although not a new crime, carjacking had been included in the general category of auto theft before the 1990s and has since been recognized as a growing threat. Initially, the more expensive vehicles were targeted, but this trend now covers all types of cars. And carjackings often occur at places like gas stations or ATMs or car washes, parking lots, shopping centers, restaurants, or mass transit stations. And by definition, carjacking is the taking of a motor vehicle by force or threat of force. So you can see that it's got some similar aspects to our standard robbery, if you will. And the force may consist, again, of the use of a handgun or a simulated handgun or any other type of weapon. And according to one survey, they showed that nearly 3 in 4 carjackings involve the use of a weapon. So typically some type of weapon is going to be used for a carjacking. So why is carjacking different than like your regular standard robbery? So just to give you a little bit of information. So remember, robbery requires the specific intent to permanently deprive the owner of their property by force or fear. That's the book definition. Remember, California is a little bit more thorough, if you will. Carjacking requires the taking of a motor vehicle specifically, intending to permanently or temporarily deprive the victim by force or fear. So there are some similarities, but there are definitely some differences. Okay, so now we're gonna check out bank robbery. So bank robbery is both a federal and state offense. U.S. Code Title 18, Section 2113 defines the elements of the federal crime of bank robbery. So bank robberies also are within the jurisdiction of the FBI, the state, and local law enforcement agencies, the area where the crime occurred. So if the bank robbery was in Redlands, the city of Redlands Police Department would be directly involved. So my question is, why do you think that the federal government, why would the FBI become involved in a bank robbery? And I'll give you just kind of a second to think about it, and then I'll kind of jump back in. So the reason for that, the answer really is that don't forget that banks are federally insured. And because of that, they're going to have the feds assist in the investigation. And the great part for the local agency is that the federal government, the FBI, the resources are unlimited. They have deep databases and MO files on suspects that have committed robberies, specifically bank robberies, along with pictures, again, MO files. Their evidence teams are used to responding to these types of crimes. So they're able to locate forensic evidence where perhaps a smaller agency may not be able to do so. So don't feel slighted when the FBI comes out to assist, because they really are there to help you. And they're a great resource to assist you to jointly investigate the bank robbery. So a couple of other interesting things about bank robbery. Because of the amount of money involved, bank robberies are committed by both amateurs and professional bank robbers or habitual criminals. Now, amateurs are more dangerous, or tend to be more dangerous, because they're really not familiar with weapons, and they're often nervous and they're fearful, and therefore things might happen where a robber that has done this a lot of times has kind of a way that they do it, and they don't want to be noticed, and they're very calm, and they'll go in, they'll do their thing, and they'll leave. And there's less likely, a chance for some type of issue to happen versus an amateur. So a different class of, or a different kind of offshoot of bank robbery, I guess, would be what we call takeover robberies. So takeover robberies are committed by heavily armed suspects who have the patrons and the employees move to an area in order to order these people to the floor. A lot of times they often jump the counter. And while these are rare, they are usually committed by professional thieves working in teams, or what we call crews. And then keep in mind that bank robbers often act alone inside the bank, but most are going to have a getaway car with lookouts posted nearby. And these individuals pose an additional problem for approaching police. The robbery car is often it's stolen, as we talked about before, and robbers are going to use the stolen car to leave the robbery scene and to transport them and the money to a place a little far away, kind of a distance away from the robbery, where they get into a cold car or a regular plated car. Does that make sense? So they've got this kind of planned out. And even if only one robber has been reported at the scene, there's a great possibility that an armed accomplice may be somewhere nearby. So just understand that. And when you look at a couple photos of these takedown robberies, again, typically these larger takedowns are done by crews, more than a couple of people, but they always have a getaway driver and they always have lookouts, etc. So while we know there are a lot of deterrents for robberies, let's take a closer look at some of the things that banks do in order to deter these crimes. So deterrents to bank robberies include things like bulletproof glass or alarms or cameras. And other deterrents include what we call bait money and die packs. Now, bait money is U.S. currency with recorded serial numbers, and they are placed at each teller position. And a die pack is a bundle of currency containing colored dye and a lot of times tear gas. And taken during a robbery, it's activated when the robber crosses the electromagnetic field at the business's exit, which releases and then the die pack will release this brightly colored dye that not only stains the money, but it emits a cloud of colored smoke, and you can see it from a long ways away. So again, these are some deterrents. And if you look at this is a photo, like a screenshot from a video on an armed robbery of a bank where a die pack went off in the car. And if you were an officer approaching a bank robbery call and you saw this vehicle, it would really attract your attention because it's got the die pack smoke. And again, a lot of times the smoke has, tear gas in it. So they're going to be choking and gagging at the same time while all this pink or blue or orange smoke is pouring out of the car. So that's a really good indicator for you. So now let's talk a little about ATM robberies. So robberies at ATM machines are also of concern. Since their introduction in the late 1960s, ATMs have become the staple of the banking industry, facilitating billions of dollars in transactions every year. And typically robbers will wait nearby for people on foot or even in a car, and usually it will occur after dark in some kind of more not well lit areas. And the common denominator a lot of times is it's one of those lone offender, lone victims. So there's not going to be a group of them hanging out because then that's obvious to the person driving up. It's just going to be a lone offender who kind of hides back and then approaches the unsuspecting male or female, the victim, and demands through force or fear their money. And that's typically what an ATM robbery kind of comes down to. Okay, so now that we know, we've kind of gone through each one of those, let's take one last look at the difference between robbery, burglary, and theft or larceny. And then we're gonna probably take a break, and then we'll come back and we'll jump into the actual elements of robbery and some challenges to investigators. So the general public tends to use the term robbery interchangeably with burglary, larceny, and theft. And these are actually three distinct crimes because there are specific elements that distinguish them from each other. So before we kind of move on, I'll ask the question, what do you think is the difference between robbery and burglary? And I'll give you a second to kind of think about it, but I'm going to flip over. So remember from our definitions, robbery is the felonious taking of personal property, either directly from the person or in their presence, through force or fear. So keep that. Remember that. Felonious taking, force or fear. Okay, so we'll just kind of keep those. Burglary, on the other hand, is the unlawful entry into a structure, and I put etc. because it's more than a structure. There's several things listed, but we're talking, it could be a residence, it could be a commercial building, but either way, it's the unlawful entry of a structure, into that structure, with intent to commit petty theft or a felony or any other type of crime. So you can see the difference because it looks like you're missing the force or fear part, right? And then finally, theft is the unlawful taking of property from another. And with that, there's no unlawful entry into anywhere. So can you kind of see the differences? Each one has its own set of elements. So that should help you kind of clear that up. And then one other difference between this: robbery suspects confront their victims, and burglary suspects try not to. They don't want to confront anybody. When you're doing a burglary, you want to break in somewhere and you don't want anybody home. And then in addition, robbery is a crime against a person, and burglary is a crime against property. So there's a couple of other factors that differentiate between robbery and burglary. So I think this might be a good place to take a very, very quick break. And, well, you know what? Where are we at? Yeah, we're at 50 minutes. So let's go ahead and take a break. And then we'll come back in just a couple minutes and we'll finish up with part 2 of our Chapter 12 lecture on robbery.